Well, Undertale's 8th anniversary has come and gone, and while this usually acts as a way for us to get a meaty info dump on Deltarune's progress, this year's update was far less substantial. I mean, Toby did say ahead of time that there weren't any big plans, so you can't fault him for a lack of clarity. But even so, it's hard not to feel a little bit underwhelmed in the amount of content we received. Even compared to newsletters past, this one was almost uniquely vague. Just a quick paragraph reiterating that Chapter 3 is still close to completion, and the inclusion of a banger stealth track that ended up being scrapped from the game. And upon this newsletter's release, essentially echoing what we've heard for half a year of newsletters at this point, I feel like something shifted in the fandom. Don't get me wrong, Drop Deltarune now is nowhere near a take unique to this situation, but it's definitely one that I've seen increase in prevalence after Undertale's anniversary. People have started to worry about the state of the game, raising an eyebrow at Toby's initial plan to drop 3 chapters together and instead pushing for Chapter 3 to drop on its own, just like Chapters 1 and 2 did. So that's what we're here to look at today. Is there merit to this solo chapter idea? Or has the fanbase's impatience began to cloud their judgment? Let's get into it. First and foremost, the obvious benefit to Chapter 3 dropping on its own is time. Chapter 3 has been the primary focus of Deltarune's dev team for more than half a year now, and while We're Finishing It has been a primary theme of these last few newsletters, this one is, logically, the most conclusive sounding of the bunch. Toby mentions the fact that Chapter 3 is finally playable from beginning to end, and that the amount of unfinished content is steadily dwindling. Considering the fact that the newsletters are written a month ahead of time, this means that even more progress has been made than what has been disclosed. It's extremely reasonable to believe that Chapter 3 will be completed this year, meaning that 2 years of waiting could come to a close should they choose to drop it, which I don't think they will, but, hypothetically. Conversely, Chapters 3, 4, and 5 dropping together could mean quite the wait. Initially, many fans, myself included, assumed that this year was the year. We were very wrong, a fact that became pretty clear once the newsletter started rolling out. Expectations then began to shift to early 2024, late 2024, and finally where we are now, no one knows what's going on. While it obviously wasn't the only part of the game being worked on at the time, Chapter 3 taking over 2 years to reach completion hasn't exactly filled people with confidence. And Toby's vagueness about the rest of the game's progress makes it very difficult to estimate an actual release window. From last year's September status update, we know that Chapters 3 and 4 were the team's primary focus in the time since Chapter 2's release, with Chapter 5 having very little progress in comparison. A few months later is when focusing on completing Chapter 3 began. In the time since then, any news on Chapter 4 has been incredibly minor, and any news on Chapter 5 has been non-existent. 2025 is now a common prediction for Deltarune's release. I've even seen 2026. Obviously, for a lot of hungry fans, having a piece of the pie now instead of potentially doubling the waiting seems preferable. Who knows, it could even end up being preferable to Toby. He specifically stated in the 2021 status update that going a long time without a release was difficult for both fans and developers, and that was only 3 years, a time frame that seems like the ideal outcome at this point. But there's more to it than that. A lot of fans' desire to see Chapter 3 drop on its own comes from more than simple impatience. Content consumption is a concern. Deltarune's release method so far has been very unique and extremely successful. Both chapter drops have been events on the internet, to put it simply. The initial reveal, only 3 years after Undertale's release, had everyone stop what they were doing to check out Gaster's Twitter account and download the survey program. And 3 years later, that exact same excitement was captured for Chapter 2's release, like no time passed at all. Deltarune clearly has the power to spawn months, no, years of speculation, discussion, and enjoyment with a single chapter. So, to many, dropping 3 chapters together not only seems pointless, but self-damaging. People fear that chapters, characters, and story beats will overshadow one another, leading to less nuanced discussion and less intricate appreciation of what could occur if they were released by themselves. If Chapter 2 had dropped as part of a larger package, would the Sweet Cap and Cakes have the fans they do now, or would they be completely overshadowed by larger characters like Noelle and Spamton? Granted, this argument comes in many forms. I've seen people vouch for yearly drops, but I've also seen people say that Toby could still maintain that natural discussion by simply releasing the chapters a few weeks apart when they're all done. Regardless, this has been a very prevalent argument as to why Chapter 3 should drop now, with 4 and 5 coming later down the line. Those, from what I can tell, are the primary reasons as to why people want Deltarune Chapter 3 to release on its own. I can certainly see where they're coming from. However, all that said, I'm not sure if I agree. That isn't to say that I'd be against the idea. If Toby randomly decided to drop Chapter 3 on Deltarune's anniversary this year, I certainly wouldn't complain about it. But despite feeling the same disappointment as many fans did this anniversary, and despite this being my most anticipated game of all time, I don't know, I think I'm still with Toby on this one. I always think back to this quote from 2022's status update. As always, I want this thing to come out the most out of anyone on the planet, so we'll be doing our best to get it done. At the end of the day, we do have to accept the fact that, obviously, Toby's just more knowledgeable about this than us. I'm not saying he's infallible when it comes to these sorts of decisions or anything, but I am saying that he's literally operating with far more information than we could possibly possess. And pieces of that information that he's given us seem to corroborate his decision to drop 3, 4, and 5 together. Take this excerpt from the summer newsletter, for instance. As you can tell, Chapter 3 is shaping up to be a pretty strange one. I mostly focused on unusual gameplay elements, and it's not too heavy on the story. Since it's so frivolous, I feel a bit self-conscious about it, but at least I got to try something different. Anyway, Chapter 4 will be a much more standard chapter. This alone gives us a really good idea as to why dropping 3 chapters simultaneously might be the best option. Toby specifically states that Chapter 3 is an unconventional one, while 4 makes up for that with its more standard nature. It's very likely that if Chapter 3 dropped on its own and we went back to near radio silence with the rest of the game, fans would be disappointed. Not because it's bad, but because it's intentionally designed to be vastly different and have the next simultaneous chapters make up for those differences. We also have to remember that splitting the chapters up in the first place was never Toby's plan. Initially, he was just going to drop Chapter 1 as a demo, then wait for the entire game to be completed. And let me just interject here to say, oh my god, that sounds horrible. We'd be looking at close to a decade of no Deltarune. Thank god he changed his mind. But even so, what this means is that by dividing the chapters into chunks, Toby is going against his initial vision for Deltarune. He's had to alter things to accommodate the fact that the story will randomly take a break for a handful of years in between certain chapters. It's very possible that Chapter 3 or even 4 have very unsatisfying endings narratively, an issue that can only be salvaged by bundling them in with Chapter 5. We have no idea where this story is going compared to Toby, who has not only a full outline, but has had one for years at this point. Again, I'm not trying to get all parasocial, over-romanticizing, whatever, but genuinely, it's just hard for me to fathom us knowing better about the release than the man behind it all. If Toby believes that dropping 3 to 5 together is the best way for us to experience Deltarune, despite the painful wait, I'm inclined to believe him. But, you know, if he decides that dropping 3 by itself is even better, I'm inclined to believe that too. But, as always, I'd love to hear what you think. Are you an advocate for Deltarune Chapter 3's solo release, or are you willing to wait it out for who knows how long? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys later.